Welcome to THA Talks, for free thought and open minds. Hello people, coming to you from London, UK and out to the universe. I'm Paul Obitelli and this is edition 41 of THA Talks, brought to you by Theo Humanist Arts. Here at THA Talks we bring you weekly shows and all the best interviews we can get our sticky mitts on. Just go to www.thatalks.com to listen to or to download all our free content. Our talks include news, conspiracies, spirituality, the occult, science, history, art, philosophy, religion and much more. If you'd like to get hold of us and send us any of your thoughts or ideas for the show, maybe a request for potential guest, you can do so by emailing info@thatalks.com. That's info@thatalks.com. Also, if you like what we're doing here, you can subscribe using our RSS feed or through various podcast directories like iTunes or Stitcher. Visit our website for more details on that. Thanks again to everyone for downloading the show and tuning in to check out our latest editions. Don't be shy, do message us if you've got anything to say or any of your views. We would like to hear your opinions on the shows and get a little bit of a reflection of how they're going down with you guys out there. Also, again, every time you link the show, it's a great help to us. You know, we're not charging anything, it's all coming off our own back, so we very much rely on you guys spreading the word and helping us grow and do our thing. So, without any further ado, I'm going to go over to the other side of London and I'm going to introduce a surge from a dramaturge, as per usual, David Parry.
Good evening, Mr. Obitelli. Our week of lunacy continues.
Indeed it does, because today we'll be speaking with Marcus Allen, who's the UK publisher of the world's leading alternative news magazine, Nexus. Marcus has been pursuing his lifelong interest in the unexplained full-time, and today we're going to be extending our moon landing chat while we're talking with Marcus, who has spent many years scrutinising the footage and disputing much of the claims from the Apollo missions. So the conversation continues, David.
Oh, evil, all these conspiracies and evil everywhere. I was talking to the Reverend Scareham and the Reverend Burnham about it. I'm not sure any of us are convinced.
Oh, I'm definitely on the fence, remaining on the fence. I mean, once you make a decision and say, I believe it, then you're risking being fooled. When you say you don't believe it, you're risking being fooled. There's definitely questions, and I don't know what the truth is, but I don't believe the official accounts of what's happened. I think that's where I sit.
Oh, evil. It seems like everyone's exaggerating everything on both sides, and this is one of the conspiracy theories that leaves me absolutely cold.
Yeah.
There are so many more important things to talk about, as I said on the last show, and it really irritates me that, with due respect to our previous guest and Marcus, that this has such prominence. The thing is, it's just down to, we can say anything. You can say, "Oh, this is a minor issue," but it's what other implications could come from it. You know, it's if it is a lie on that mass scale, then they shouldn't be leading a country, let alone, you know, this is a very serious thing. If this kind of thing lies, that kind of money can be taken from a nation and put into that to create such a lie. So I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying I don't think you can underestimate the seriousness of it if it is true. I mean, you know, it's a bit like the same thing with the Kennedy assassination, 9/11. All these conspiracies, if they are true, it's massive because it has so much that can leak over onto other issues in the world. It's there. You see, the magic word prefixing all of those sentences is if. I've got a book on my shelf called The 60 Greatest Conspiracy Theories of All Time by, who is it again? Vankin and Whaler? I can't quite remember. They all contradict each other. They all make a very fine read. Hey, where's the proof?
Well, with that trail of thought, though, we can say anything we don't know for a fact we shouldn't ask questions about.
No, it just means don't believe two improbable things before breakfast instead of just one. I don't know. I think it's always healthy to ask questions. I mean, you shouldn't get obsessive about it and kind of say to people, oh, I don't believe that on every single thing that comes out in the news or any incident. You just make a conspiracy out of it. But when there's things that don't make sense and need questioning, I'd say it's more unhealthy not to question it, But there we go.
My view is some things are made into conspiracies when, hey, let's talk about something else a lot more sensible instead. That really is my whole stance on whether the moon exists or not, and blah, blah, blah. I'll need heavy convincing.
Well, I think the moon exists. It's not that whether the moon exists and stuff, but no, I just think that every conspiracy. I know they're all different conspiracies. Like whether you talk about 9/11, whether you talk about the moon landings, whether you talk about the Kennedy assassination, whatever conspiracies you look at, agree with or don't. If they are all real, they've moulded the world we are living in now.
You see, Paul, that's where we must part company. I don't think you can talk about conspiracies as a whole. They're different subjects about different materials, and the fact that the same people are blamed for all of these different things, I think, is just bewildering. I can't go along with it.
Well, I mean, if the president if Kennedy that was shot and the moon landings were faked, surely the people that had the power to carry off something like that and to keep it a secret, it's not out of the question to think that they're the same cartel. No? It's
not out of the question, and it's not out of the question they're all aliens. It's not out of the question they're all time travelers. If. I am sympathetic to all of these areas, but when it comes to certain conspiracies, I need very heavy convincing indeed, and this is one of them.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, for me, if you either leave an if as an if, or you dig deep and try and find out if that if can become a is. But the only way you can do that is by asking questions and looking, and keep doing that. But anyway, we will agree to disagree on that, and I'm sure Marcus has some interesting stuff to add to the debate on this. Let's get to it. Hi Marcus, welcome to the show.
Very nice to be here, Paul. Thank you for inviting me.
No worries. We're having a bit of a moon landing week this week, and last Sunday we had Bart Sibril on the show to talk about his views on the moon landings and stuff. Have you managed to check that show out at all? Or
I haven't got it out yet. No, okay. I haven't. So,
have you heard of him at all?
Oh yes, yeah. I know Bart Sibril. I know what he does. He was the one who got punched by Buzz Aldrin.
That's right. Yeah, we had him on. He basically said he regretted, some of the way he spoke to them, and he admitted he was a little bit in their faces and so on, and he did apologise for them for all that. So that was nice to hear. But it was very interesting. He's very passionate about it all and stuff. Have you checked out his footage?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, and what are your views on that?
He's done some very interesting research, very in-depth research. He was the one who publicised that the famous picture of Earth taken from inside the Apollo 11 craft, wasn't he?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And basically saying that they were so much more closer to the Earth that they were trying to make out, and then when they radioed into them saying how far they were, it wasn't quite adding up and stuff. But there's a lot of views on the movie because it's obviously the debate's been going for so many years now. There's a lot of skeptics that have had their film managed to debunk a lot of things that are out there that were going around for a while, but there's also a lot of questions still that linger. And what's your main gripe with the moon landings yourself?
It's mainly to do with the photographs. That's the area that I've concentrated on. The Apollo photographs. Not just Apollo 11, but all the Apollo images. There are so many anomalies and inconsistencies within the photographs that you do have to question whether they were actually taken where they were supposedly taken, which is on the lunar surface. Because in order to take them on the lunar surface, they had to get there.
Yeah.
Assuming it's the lunar surface that when we look out the windows we can right now and look at the moon, 240-odd thousand miles away, that was the place they were supposedly at. Now, there are various questions that have arisen, even before they got there, which is to do with the power of the Saturn V rocket. Was it powerful enough to do what we were told it did, i.e. launch 130 tons of craft into Earth orbit, otherwise known as LEO, low Earth orbit, and then launch 46 tons of lunar lander and command module into lunar orbit. And before they even got there, there's another question which has never been satisfactorily resolved, which is, how were they protected from the radiation that is acknowledged to exist in space outside the Van Allen radiation belts? So we've got two questions there. Was the rocket powerful enough to launch what we were told it did launch? And how were they protected against the really quite severe radiation in space? Now, it's very difficult to find out about the radiation levels. Very difficult. And you'll get a lot of discussion about it, where people will say, well, obviously they didn't suffer very much because they all got there and they got back again. But that's the circular argument, which isn't necessarily answering the question, because if you look at the dangers of radiation, and they are quite severe, beyond Earth orbit, there are the Van Allen radiation belts, about 250 miles up, stretched to up to about 40,000 miles above the Earth's surface. These are belts of radiation which are created and held in place by the Earth's magnetic field. Now that's a known physical fact. There's no dispute that Van Allen radiation belts exist, because the very first time that America launched a satellite into space, it was Explorer 1. One of the experiments they were doing this was 1958, one of the experiments they were doing was to measure the strength of the Van Allen radiation belts. They're called Van Allen radiation belts after Professor James Van Allen, who was the man who did the first experiments. Now, having done that, having sent basically a Geiger counter up in their satellite, the Geiger counter stopped working. So they thought, oh dear, what a pity, we'll have to do it again. When they examined the data, what they found was the Geiger counter had stopped working because it was overwhelmed by the level of radiation. I.e., there was a lot more radiation out there than they'd expected. Now, radiation is invisible, obviously, and it contains all sorts of wavelengths of electromagnetic light. Visible light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, and all the other nasties up there are the ones which cause damage to humans. We don't get damaged on Earth because we're protected by the Van Allen radiation belts. So the true level of radiation doesn't reach the Earth's surface. However, one should also recall that when Concorde was flying, and it was usually flying at about 60 to 65,000 feet, i.e. quite high, but not all that high, about 12 miles above the Earth's surface, it actually carried a radiation meter on board, not to protect the passengers, because they weren't going to be in the craft for long enough, but to protect the crew, because if the radiation levels exceeded a certain point, the crew would not be then allowed to continue flying for some time, because radiation is cumulative in the human body. So radiation is known to exist, and it's known to cause problems to humans. And you may recall many years ago when you went when security was first installed at airports, they had X-ray machines to X-ray your luggage and stuff to make sure you weren't carrying any nasties. And you were always advised that if you had a camera with film, this is not digital, this is film cameras, you were always advised to have them hand searched. I don't put it through the X-ray machine because it will fog the film. And it did. So radiation is known to damage photographic film, which incidentally is why photographic film usually carried an expiry date. And you think, well, that's a bit odd. Why would there be an expiry date on photographic film? Not biological, it can't rot. No, the reason it had that expiry date was because if it was lying around for too long, it could be affected by background radiation, and the film would be not as, you wouldn't get as good quality pictures, and the manufacturers Kodak and Fuji didn't want you to use film which may give you bad results, so there was an expiry date on it. So radiation is a known problem.
Yeah.
And the rocket is a known problem, the Saturn V rocket, because, and here's the interesting thing about the Saturn V rocket, it's a magnificent piece of kit, and it was developed and designed by Werner von Braun, who was a German SS officer in the Second War, brought over to the United States under Operation Paperclip and put to work on the American space program. And he gave himself up to the American forces in Germany so that he wasn't going to be captured and taken over to Russia, which was the other option. And he brought over with him 120-odd members of his team from Peenemünde who had been making the V2 rockets, which were launched over London. Thanks, guys. You know, it was a very unpleasant experience, anybody who'd been anywhere near one of them. So Werner von Braun came over. He designed this rocket, the Saturn V rocket, which was, we're told, contained 5 engines to drive the main rocket, the one that we saw take off. And those engines developed, each of them, 1.5 million pounds of thrust. So it was 7.5 million pounds in total. Very powerful. It's what you would expect to have to launch 120 tons, 130 tons into low Earth orbit. Now, once the Saturn V's had finished their job, the last one was launched in 1975, the Soyuz Apollo link-up, but that was only in low Earth orbit. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 had previously been cancelled by President Nixon for whatever reason. There was never a reason I could find as to why they were cancelled, other than maybe, well, we've done that, we don't need to do it again, sort of thing. For the next 10 years, the space shuttle was going to take the place of space capsules. The space shuttle is quite a big piece of kit, weighs about 50 tons, and that was going to be launched on a newly developed rocket system with 2 solid fuel booster rockets, the long, thin pencil-shaped things on the side, and a big main tank. And I think, hang on a minute, why do they need to develop a completely new rocket system, which is not as powerful as the Saturn V rocket, in order to do a job which the Saturn V have apparently been doing successfully from 1968 onwards, when it launched Apollo 8. 9 launches were successfully completed with the Saturn V rocket. And suddenly that's all forgotten, and we're going to start again and do the space shuttle, which isn't going to go anywhere near as far away as the Saturn V. So that's an unanswered question even now. And then if we bring this right up to date, we've got the Constellation program, which is supposedly, it was announced by President George W. Bush in 2004, the return to the moon and to Mars. Everybody cheers. NASA have got a really good objective to go again. 2004. Now, 2010, President Obama cancels it, the Constellation program, because, get this, we've been there to the moon, but we'll go to Mars, and it's going to take 20 years to develop the equipment. 2030 is supposedly when it's going to happen, and President Obama said, I expect to be around to see it. Well, he may well be. But what happened? Why did they cancel it? And the current issue of Nexus carries a very interesting article about exactly this situation. What's the problem about returning to the moon? And the problem appears to be that they can't do it. They don't have a rocket powerful enough to launch the necessary weight into low Earth orbit and consequently into lunar orbit. There isn't a rocket that exists now that could do it. But there's no reference to the Saturn V rocket in any of the research. There's a 750-page report called the Architecture Report, which looks at all the problems to do with getting to the moon in the 21st century. And they can't do it. Now, aside from the rocket, which is one aspect of it, you've got another aspect, which is how do you protect the astronauts from the dangers of radiation in space? Hang on a minute. Didn't 12 astronauts walk on the lunar surface? And another 15, another 12, because 3 of them went twice. Didn't they go into lunar orbit and stay in the command module? And Apollo 8, and 3 of them orbited the moon. Apollo 10 almost landed, but didn't quite, and so on. Didn't all that happen? And there was obviously no problem from radiation damage. So why are they suddenly concerned about the dangers of radiation in space? And why haven't they got the records, which NASA must have had available, to show that you don't actually need much protection on the lunar surface, because they put 12 astronauts there who walked around on the lunar surface for about 3 days, in the case of Apollo 17. Yeah. Why are they looking at something which supposedly was easily solved 45 years ago? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, flicking around on Google and through various forums and so on, you hear a lot of skeptics that are claiming that the trajectory that their path took was kind of looping a little bit outside of where the dangerous radiation belt was, and hence why it didn't damage them and it wasn't an issue. It's kind of a bit, I don't know, it's a bit sort of contradictory. I don't know what to make of it all, but I have heard people make those claims that apparently, I don't know if it was NASA that claimed it or not, but have you heard that before?
Oh yes, one hears that all the time.
And you don't buy that, or?
It's a circular argument again, because they obviously got to the moon, because we've seen all the pictures and the films and the astronauts all said they went to the moon. Therefore they must have got there. Therefore they must have got round the radiation problem by launching in a particular angle to avoid the Van Allen radiation belts, which ignores the fact that in deep space, i.e. 40,000 miles above the Earth's surface, you've got all this radiation which is created by the Van Allen radiation belts. Because it's deep space, it's solar flares, it's basically all the stuff in space that is best avoided if you're a human, unless you're protected. And photographic film also needs to be protected. Yeah, I've heard the arguments, well, they angled the rocket in such a way that they missed the Van Allen radiation belts. Okay, how did they do it? What was the angle that they took? Because all we're told was that they launched out of Cape Kennedy, which is in Florida, and they head out towards Africa. It appears that they're going straight up, or more or less straight up. I mean, once that rocket is launched, 2 minutes after it ignites and takes off, it's out of sight, and we've got to rely on NASA to tell us where it's going. And then you hear all these stories about, oh well, people watched the translunar injection ignition of the rocket taking off, and you could see it. Oh really? Where is the photographs of it? Where is the film of the translunar injection, which is the third stage of the Saturn V rocket, the top bit, igniting to drive itself and the lunar module and the command module into lunar orbit? Where is the film of it? I've never seen it. I've always heard about it. I've heard about a lot of things, but I don't, there are 3 things I believe in life. Father Christmas, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny. For everything else, I want evidence.
Yeah.
Where is the evidence?
Yeah, I think you get a lot, not with just the moon landings. You get these situations where there obviously are widespread conspiracies that so many people are questioning and talking about, and yet there just seems to be this sort of arrogant stance with them, as if like, oh, you're just silly people that are you haven't got the right brains to understand what we're going to talk to you about. But they don't really tackle all the questions. It's almost like they'll answer one or two and they now go away. You're just looking for entertainment, or even if we told you the truth, you wouldn't listen. And that makes it worse, because we're not just talking about a couple people that are on the internet. There's a lot of Americans and a lot of other people around the world that are, you know, raising these questions and so on, but they don't seem to, which is why we're still here chatting about it. One other thing I wanted to ask for your views on it. There was another thing going around, is Stanley Kubrick supposedly helping create some of the footage or all of it, and particularly using front screen projection as a method for some of the effects on with the films. Have you got any views on that?
Well, Stanley Kubrick certainly did use front screen projection technology on 2001: A Space Odyssey. He was one of the very first filmmakers to do so, because he was always looking for the latest technology to help create the pictures. Remember the famous lens he used on Barry Lyndon, which would actually, you could actually see the actors even though they were actually illuminated by real candlelight. And he had a lens which allowed sufficient light through the lens, because it had a very wide aperture, so that he could actually film it by candlelight, and it was extremely effective. But yes, Stanley Kubrick did use front screen projection on the ape scenes, the African savannah scenes in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it is, no dispute about that at all. Whether the link can then be made by that Stanley Kubrick directed some of the Apollo landing shots, I don't buy it, because the timing is wrong for a start. He was 2001: A Space Odyssey was actually released in 1968. He had been working on it for about 4 years prior to that at Pinewood Studios. He only ever worked in England because he was. I believe he was actually very frightened of flying. There are all sorts of stories around that, and then if you look at the film he made after that with Jack Nicholson,
The Shining.
The Shining, where there are all sorts of clues that apparently indicate that he had some link with it, and there are some tantalizing clues. I mean, the little boy in The Shining, where he stands up at one point and he's wearing a pullover with a rocket on it that says Apollo. And you think, oh, that's interesting. And then the final film he made, Eyes Wide Shut, he died actually before the premiere took place, but he had specified that the premiere of Eyes Wide Shut should be held on July the 19th, 1999, which happened to be the 30th anniversary of the landing on the moon. And you think, hang on, there's all sorts of little clues here. But Stanley Kubrick also had a great sense of humor. I don't see enough evidence that Stanley Kubrick would have been in a position to create it. And if he did, he would have created it in England with British crews working at Pinewood Studio. And I honestly don't see that the crews at Pinewood Studio, who are very professional, amongst the best in the world in terms of technical ability, would have gone along with it without somebody saying, just have a look over there, there's some very strange things going on. I don't see that happening.
Do you think that they may have still used front screen projection to get the effects even without him, though? Do you think that technique can be proved? Or?
I think that's probably provable, certainly on Apollo 17. Because one of the problems with front screen projection, which is basically a big cinema screen onto which is projected whatever image you want to make, whether it's the background of an African plane or whether it, anything, you can project anything you like onto it.
Yeah.
And it's done with a two-way mirror, so that the camera is actually looking through the same mirror that has split the light from the projector that is projecting the screen. So that's why you can get the actors acting in front of it and not casting a shadow onto the screen. It's a very simple but very effective device.
It sounded quite likely. I think there was one bit of footage I've seen that sort of questioned that, or at least that bit of footage was when you had the rover that was driving. It was quite a lot of footage, and you saw the rover driving in the same direction for quite a few moments, and there was no. You'd think if that was front stream projection, would they be able to carry that effect? Do you know what I mean? It's like if you're standing in one position, it's okay to just manipulate the background, but if you're moving towards it for a while, then that throws that into a bit of question mark. So that's the only thing that I've seen that's maybe think, I don't know about that, but who knows?
If you've got a radio controlled model, you wouldn't need a very big set, would you?
Oh yeah, I've heard that's what you mean. So that it was actually very small, and
it was a relatively small set. No, the point I was making about the artifact of front screen projection is, if you look at the pictures, all the films taken with where a front screen projection is used, what you get is a fairly clear defining line between the actual three-dimensional stage on which the actors are acting and performing, and the background, which is basically a two-dimensional screen. And you actually get a dividing line between the two, which can be seen on quite a lot of the photographs, specifically on Apollo 17. You get this very clearly defined, accurate images in the foreground. You know, it's the lander and the rover and the astronauts and the moon dust. And then you've got behind them, maybe 2 or 3 miles away, if it was taking place on the moon, maybe about 2 or 3 miles away, you see they're not clearly defined at all. They're almost blank. There's very little detail in the mountains. You think, well, why would that be? There's no atmosphere to diffuse the light. But if it was being projected onto a big screen, it would start to lose definition. It would start to lose impact. And quite a few of the images, Apollo 15 is another one which is noticeable, that the backgrounds are very almost blank, no features in them at all. The foregrounds are highly detailed, and that's not how photographs work either. But they do work that way if you're photographing a screen. No matter how good the screen is in terms of reflecting the light from the projector, there's still a relatively small amount of light coming from a projector. You know, even if it's a 1,000-watt bulb, because it's got to cover a big area, and you can only have it from one source. So whether Kubrick himself was involved, I don't know, because there is a marvelous little documentary which appears to show all sorts of famous people being interviewed, and Kubrick's wife is involved, and his name, Rumsfeld, is involved, and Kissinger is involved, and they all appear to be talking about faking the moon landings. It was actually, originally that was a French film, and it's very cleverly done, because the guy who did it has done other films in a similar vein. You're taking them out of context.
Oh, so it's kind of like was it like a spoof sort of thing, or were they really talking about the moon, or?
They appear to be talking about the moon, but they might have been talking about it in the context in which it's shown in that film.
Yeah.
It's what's basically known as a mockumentary. You know, you got documentaries, you get mockumentaries.
Yeah. I think I know the one you mean. Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. Yeah.
It's a fascinating piece of film because you watch it and you think, hey, all these guys knew about it. What's going on here? No, it's not that simple.
Well, sorry, carry on.
I mean, just one thing. If Kubrick had been involved, he'd have made a better job of it. He was a perfectionist. Yeah,
I love his films. I think he was one talented dude.
God, isn't he just?
Yeah. But before we bring David into the talk, I'd just like to bring up the subject of China, because they seem to be very active in that in their space programs at the moment. Can you foresee them blowing this out of the water, or problems in the future? I mean, that's quite an interesting one, because if they go to these locations and kind of say, hang on, weren't Apollo meant to be here? Yeah, you know, because there was a photograph, wasn't there, that apparently NASA released and said, and it looks like a little spot on I don't know if they've managed to get better photos since then, but it didn't look completely compelling, convincing rather, not compelling, convincing. But yeah, you know, what do you think of that?
What, those rather poor quality photographs that NASA produced and said, here are all the landers?
Yeah.
But you can only see them because we put a bloody great arrow on it showing where it is. Yes, those
Yeah.
were. I fell about laughing when I saw that.
And can you foresee China perhaps playing a part in this?
Certainly, I can see China doing it. I can see Russia doing it. I can see India doing it. I can see Japan doing it. One of the points, one of the things that I often get asked when I do presentations of this material, I talk about the photographs mainly, and I always get asked the same questions. And usually the first one is, well, surely if what you're saying, Marcus, is true, the Russians would have blown the whistle. Which is a logical question. It's quite legitimate to ask it because it's so obvious, really, when you think about it. Of course Russia would have blown the whistle. Until you actually think about how they would have blown it, who would have told them, because the Russian method of control, political control, economic control, is very, very different from those of America and Britain and the West. Who in Russia would have blown the whistle? There's only one person who could do it, and that's the president. At that time, it was Brezhnev. Who would have had access to Brezhnev with sufficient knowledge of the American space program to be able to convince him, Brezhnev, that what the whole world had watched was a fake? And now, the only person who could have done that is a guy called Sergei Korolev, who was the head of the Russian space program. Brilliant engineer, probably better even than von Braun. He had died very suddenly as a result of an operation, quite a legitimate operation. I think he had a heart attack, and he died in 1966, before the Americans had landed on the moon. There was nobody in Russia with sufficient knowledge and sufficient political connection to be able to persuade the Politburo at the time that what they were watching was probably a fabrication. Now, there's another very important factor here. We're hearing a lot about this supply of Russian natural gas into Europe, which comes mainly through the Ukraine. It also comes through what's called the North Pipeline, and it comes into through Poland into Germany. Those pipelines were first created in the mid-1960s, and they were created after Russia had discovered their immense reserves of natural gas. Russia don't have that many industries, but they do have natural resources, and they were just discovering the extent of their natural resources in the mid-1960s. And the market they wanted to open to sell this stuff to was Europe. They had a problem. Russia had a major problem, because when you're going to produce a pipeline to drive natural gas thousands of kilometers from Siberia into Europe, you've got to build a big pipeline. And the pipes are about 1.4 meters in diameter. Quite big, because you've got a lot of gas going through them. And the Russians didn't have the ability to make pipes of that diameter in that quantity to the quality required. So there was a deal struck. It's called gas for pipes. Check it out. It's all quite legitimate. The pipes were made by Germany. Germany was one of the major markets for Russian gas. This is in the mid-1960s, 20 years after the end of World War II. Two major German companies, Thyssens and Mannesheim, made the pipes in exchange for gas. Was anybody going to upset America to the extent that these pipes were not supplied to Russia and the gas was not supplied to Western Europe? Not just Germany, it was Italy, Austria, ultimately virtually every country. France takes a major portion of it. Both Germanys at the time were taking it. This was East and West Germany, through to the Netherlands. There was huge supply of gas. This would take precedence over any idea of America faking it. And to be honest, the Russians weren't particularly interested. They had other problems to worry about. There was also a drought in Russia on the steppes in the wheat belt of Russia. There was a drought in the late 1960s. America very generously supplied 25 million tons of wheat for 2 years, 50 million tons altogether. Were Russia going to jeopardize that supply? Of course not. I don't know if a price came with it. So you've got the gas supply into Europe, you've got the wheat supply into Russia, and you've got some vaudeville show going on the moon. What's going to take precedence? Of course it's going to take. And this moon rock, oh dear, the moon rock that proves we went to the moon, I got a lump of it here. I'm looking at it now. I don't know if it's moon rock or not, but it could be. There's a piece of moon rock in the Science Museum. And you go to the Science Museum and you look at it, and you know it's moon rock because it says moon rock. So it's obviously moon rock.
Yeah.
And it could only come from the moon, couldn't it? And when the Apollo 11 astronauts were doing their world tour, meeting everybody from the Queen to presidents and prime ministers and all the rest of it around the place, they presented a piece of moon rock to all the countries they visited, one of which was the Netherlands. They presented it to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Very generous. This piece of moon rock, quite a big piece as it happened, was shown on display at the Rijksmuseum, one of the great museums of the world, in Amsterdam. About 5 or 6 years ago, the Rijksmuseum underwent a major renovation, so they had to move all the displays, and one of the things moved was the moon rock. And some of the geologists in Amsterdam decided they'd have a close look at their piece of moon rock. And do you know what they found? It was a piece of petrified wood. Seriously,
Yeah.
It was a piece of petrified wood, so they kept it as a curio. But we're not told to have petrified wood on the moon.
Yeah,
Now,
that's fishy.
If you want to do any filming of the moon, let's say, there are companies in America that will supply you moon rock. How do you think Tom Hanks dressed his set when he did his mini-series From the Earth to the Moon? There are companies that supply it. They'll supply you rocks, there's big ones, little ones, the sort of regolith, which is the earth, the sort of dusty bits that you see them walking around in. And there are companies that will supply. They ask, how many kilos do you want? How many tons do you want? They do as much as you like. But getting moon rock isn't a problem.
Yeah.
Getting photographs is a problem.
Okay, well, David, are you there?
He's obviously shocked.
Is he been cut off?
No, I've not.
Oh, there we go.
Off.
No, there he is. I can hear him. Hello, David.
Hi there, Marcus. Good to finally get involved. I love Barry Lyndon. What a wonderful film.
Wasn't it?
Pleased with it. Wasn't it gorgeous? All those wonderful, warm shots. Beautiful. And it is. It was quite extraordinary. And I've been sat here thinking about one of my favourite H.G. Wells stories, The First Men in the Moon. So I'm having a nice time so far.
Oh, good.
I confess Paul and I do not see eye to eye on this subject. I'm a bit conflicted, though. I thought you were one of the people that were saying the Americans had been to the moon, but the photographs had been heavily manipulated, rather than you didn't think the astronauts had been to the moon. Could you clarify that for me?
Yeah, certainly. The only evidence for American astronauts on the moon are the photographs and the rocks and the films and the interviews with the astronauts, certainly. But if you then look at the other problems, some of which we've already discussed with Paul, the radiation problem, the power of the rocket, there's one thing I haven't mentioned, which is, again, a major issue with the return to the moon. You see, I don't know if we got to the moon or not. I don't see the evidence for it. I don't see the independently available evidence that man has landed on the moon. They may well have done. It's possible it was a one-way trip. It's possible the Russians were involved. But the evidence that man has landed on the moon is so tenuous, other than NASA telling us every time anybody questions it. Of course they went to the moon. And if you do ask NASA, they'll say the evidence is in the photographs. Now, I've examined the photographs, as you know, and the photographs are so dubious in terms of their the inconsistencies and the anomalies and the unexplained details, that one has to say it's possible they never got there, and the whole thing was fabricated as a result of the times at which it occurred. This is the late 1960s, the height of the Vietnam War, the height of the Cold War, the middle of the space race. America did not have the option of coming second. They'd been beaten into virtually every space first there had been. The Russians got the first rocket up, the first satellite up, first man up, the first woman up, first to Mars, first to Venus, first to land on, or first to get a rocket to the moon, 1959. America were nowhere. And they had to demonstrate, given what else was going on, and it's necessary to look at the political events that were occurring at the same time, what else was likely to upset the balance? Because there's a big balance of communism and capitalism going on, which is basically the Cold War. Don't even get me started on the Cold War, which is a complete fiction, complete fabrication, a brilliant way of generating vast sums of money for large industries. But it was never, ever going to happen. There was never going to be a nuclear war. Nuclear bombs don't just go off any old place. They go off strictly controlled locations at strictly predetermined times. So the Cold War had to be maintained as a fiction. And the rockets that were launching Russians and Americans into space were all the same rockets that were going to launch these nuclear weapons everywhere. That was never going to happen. So we've been misled. Sorry.
You're a very, very interesting man. I mean, we're of the generation that remembers the Cold War. You must come back and do a show on the theatrical terror of the Cold War. I think we have very similar opinions on that. And it was presented as a terrifying prospect. I think our generation remembers that.
Yeah, it'll be very good to do that. It's an area which I've looked into considerable detail. And I think, that's an absolutely vital subject, because I can't think of it. You know, it colours the whole politics of today. We definitely be back to discuss that. Okay.
Let me expand my worries about all of this, Marcus. I mean, not with you. I mean, you're a publisher and distributor for Nexus magazine, a very respected alternate organ for free thought and open minds, exactly what this podcast stands for. My concern is, if this is a real conspiracy, it strikes me that the conspiracy theorists are asking the wrong questions. I recall when I was a child, I cannot remember for certain which astronaut it was or which moon landing it was. I believe it was Neil Armstrong. In black and white footage on the BBC, getting off a capsule, and suddenly a Freemasonry apron was sported around. And he started, I believe it was him, do correct me if I'm wrong, started performing a Freemasonry ritual on the moon. And the BBC presenters were so uneasy, they made an excuse. I remember the wording to this day. Oh, that's what Americans like doing. What an extraordinary comment. If it's all fictive, if it's all narration, if it's all fiction, why do you think things like that would creep into the overall story?
There are a lot of strange stories that have surrounded the whole Apollo program. Certainly the Freemasonry aspect of it, I've heard mentioned several times. The only factual information that I've got, I've just finished reading the book First Man, which is the biography of Neil Armstrong. It goes into considerable detail about his life, his personality. He was a very, very skilled pilot. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. The only ceremony that I'm aware of that was performed on the moon was done by Buzz Aldrin, who brought with him a very small wafer of communion bread and a very small bottle of communion wine. And he conducted his own service on the moon, the bread and the wine. He was a fairly devout Christian, and this is something that he wanted to do. I've never heard or seen any evidence of Masonic ritual or Masonic regalia being worn on the moon. It was pretty strictly controlled.
I will track that one. Yeah, I will track that one down for you, Marcus, because I remember it to this day and shocked at what I was seeing.
Yeah.
I'll get back to you on that, because that in itself is a shock. Yeah.
Well, that may well come in with. There are a couple of other stories which are in the same sort of category as difficult to prove but sound logical at the time. One of which is supposedly the communication. Because bear in mind, on the moon they had two communication channels. One was the voice channel, which was with Houston, where they talk and discuss what's going on, describe what's going on, and when President Nixon talked to them on the moon, that's the channel they were using. But they also had another channel, which is primarily for the medical data. They were monitoring heartbeats and respiration, all the things you would expect people to want to keep an eye on. So there was obviously a means of separate communication. People have come up with all sorts of wonderful stories about what was said on the second channel. One of which is that Armstrong is supposed to have said, as they landed, they're by the crater, they're watching us, they're huge, we're going to have to leave. Meaning UFOs, presumably. I've never ever heard the recording of that. The other one is the famous and apocryphal story of Neil Armstrong as he landed on the moon, and just after he'd said his one small step, one big giant leap bit, said, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." You heard that one?
I've heard that one, yeah.
And they spent a long time trying to find out who Mr. Gorski was, thinking he was somebody in the Russian space program. And they tracked him down, and it was Neil Armstrong's neighbor when he was a boy. I won't recount the story because it's a bit rude. But that is apocryphal as well. And as I say, the origin of it is exposed or recounted in the book First Man. They actually do mention that particular story. And there is somebody who's supposed to have said it. So there are all sorts of add-on stories. This one about them being watched as they land on the moon, and we've got to get out of here because, we're not welcome, sort of thing. And then the other side of it, there are all sorts of buildings and ruined buildings that are supposedly on the moon, and they're always airbrushed out of the photographs. And the interesting thing about that is that if you start to use Photoshop or any other photo manipulation software, you can actually see these things. It's the artifact of the front screen projection. That's the effect it has. And if you start manipulating the photographs, you can actually produce buildings out of because a screen is just lots and lots of little beads of light, or the reflect light. And if you enhance it and increase the contrast and all the other things you can do with manipulation, you can produce all this effect. So this is what is so strange. This is what is so manipulated. Now, the one thing I haven't mentioned, which I think one should mention at this point, is the third major aspect of getting to the moon. We mentioned the rocket, we mentioned the radiation and the protection required from it. If you're going to come back from the moon to the Earth, you're coming back at the same speed you leave, 25,000 miles an hour. And the way they did that was to enter the Earth's atmosphere, which is only 60 miles thick. We're not talking a long distance here. 60 miles. You have to slow the spacecraft down from 25,000 miles an hour to about 50 miles an hour when the parachute's open. In 60 miles. There's an enormous heat generated by that. In order to stop the spacecraft burning up, they had a heat shield, which the space shuttle does as well. But the space shuttle doesn't enter at the same speed. It enters at 50% lower speed, 17,500 miles an hour, not 25,000. So a spacecraft coming back from the moon has to have a heat shield to protect it. A heat shield is the type of material which, as it heats up, it will destroy the material that is being heated. It's called ablative material. It will absorb heat and it will, in effect, destroy itself. Without it, you've got no chance, as we saw with the second shuttle accident, where the heat shield on the space shuttle had been damaged by a chunk of ice falling off the main fuel tank at launch, and the shuttle broke up. That's what happens if you haven't got a proper heat shield. When they're starting to look at returning to the moon, they said, well, we're going to need a heat shield. We're going to have to build one. Well, what happened on Apollo? Haven't they got any of that material? Don't they know how to make that? Apparently not. So you've got all these problems that exist in the 21st century that apparently were all solved in the 1960s. I don't believe it. I just don't believe that the evidence for the moon landing is strong enough to stand up to the sort of scrutiny it's now happening.
Very interesting. Let me just throw in one last thing before Paul comes back in. I mean, all of my mystic friends keep telling me, and I think they're probably right, that the universe reflects back at you any truth you project on it. I think there's something to that. And just because something can be done doesn't mean that it has been done. So my concern, not with you, I think you've adopted a very measured criticism towards all this, but some of the more pyrotechnic displays of criticism of the moon landings, it just strikes me that wouldn't the NASA engineers have seen the criticisms coming in advance? Why wouldn't they have been more cautious?
They probably were not. They weren't thinking like this. There were 400,000 people working on the Apollo program at the height of the development of it, which started in 1961 and was completed by 1969, so about 8 years. They were doing the very best job they could. They were building the best rockets they could, the best spaceships they could, the best control centers, the best spacesuits they could. They were doing all these things to the best of their ability. But if you were building a spacesuit in Wisconsin, let's say, I don't know if they built them there, but let's say Wisconsin, you would have no idea what was happening with the guys building the lunar rovers in Seattle. No idea. 2,000 miles away, and different company, and you have no interest in it because they're doing their job, you're doing your job. As far as you're concerned, you're doing the best job you can. And when everything comes together, and they put it all in the vehicle assembly building, that huge, great 500-foot high building in Florida, and roll the Saturn V rocket out, they think, wow, look, they're going to the moon in that. That's fantastic. I had a part of that. They're going to feel very proud because they have no reason not to feel proud. And they should have felt proud. They did a very, very good job. But there are 45 years after Apollo 11, which was July of this year, 45 years, there are more questions being asked than there were 30 years ago, 20 years ago. The questions are getting increasingly accurate. Now, here's one question I asked. I was looking at this is the time of Chernobyl, late 1980s, when I started looking at this whole Apollo business. That's how long I've been doing it for. And I thought, hey, these spacesuits they used to go to the moon, they protected the astronauts against the radiation in space. Couldn't the same spacesuits be used by technicians to go to Chernobyl and help clear up the mess? And 3 Mile Island, and as we now know, it's Fukushima. So I wrote to NASA and said exactly that question. Couldn't they be used? And NASA, the company, no, I didn't write to NASA to start with. I wrote to Hamilton Standard, the company that made the spacesuits, part of the International Latex Corporation, as it happened, who make bras. And said, could these same spacesuits be used, et cetera, et cetera? And they said, we built them according to the specification required by NASA. You better direct your question to them. I'm still waiting for the reply.
My heavens, that's very, very interesting. I'll admit one thing: the first casualty of any war is the truth, and I'm certain that that was a casualty of the Cold War as well. Young Paul, where are you in all this?
Well, all I know is we're very much nearly out of time, so unfortunately, have to draw it to a close there. But yeah, you know, it's like David said earlier, it would be great to get you back on, Marcus, because this has been our first year on this show, and we're very eager to get fine gentlemen like yourself to come on and to discuss things with us, any other subjects as well. You've obviously got a lot of research with your magazine Nexus, as you come across a lot of interesting things there. So yeah, it would be great to get you back on. And unless there's anything else you'd like to quickly let our listeners know about, or David, if you'd like to add.
Well, I mean, you know, it's a real privilege to have someone like Marcus on the show. I mean, he's measured, he's thoughtful, he's very, very well read. And he's actually hit upon one of the subjects that's at the back of my mind, the theatre of the Cold War, because we're looking at international political theatre again at the moment with hidden motivations. So I think, Paul, we need him back sooner rather than later.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that'd be great if Marcus is happy to come back. We're all good.
I'd be delighted to come back when we can discuss one of those enigmatic phrases, broken arrows. Now, if you know what that phrase means, it's a Native American term. Broken arrows, empty quivers, these are all Cold War terminologies.
Right.
We can discuss that.
Yeah.
Nice one.
Yeah. No, that sounds really cool. Anything else you'd like to let our listeners know about before we wrap it up?
I would just say I'll make an appeal that I make quite regularly if I talk about the subject of Apollo. If there is anybody listening, anybody out there who has information to prove me wrong, please let me have it, because I want to believe the man has landed on the moon. But I want the evidence in order that I can believe it. And at the moment, the evidence is sketchy at best and non-existent at worst. So if you
have you got a website or
nexusmagazine.com.
Nexusmagazine.com. Okay.
Yeah. Just write to that and it'll be forwarded on to me. Or you could do it through yourself, through your podcast.
Yeah. Now, if we get any messages, we'll forward them on to you and so on.
Yeah, and I'm delighted to answer. You know, anybody who writes to me, emails me about the subject, I will always reply, because maybe I get information.
Excellent.
I hope so. Yeah. So let's hear from the physicists, the astrobiologists, the rocket engineers, everybody out there. Come on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the invitation has been laid down. So thanks again, Marcus, and we hope we'll be speaking with you soon.
I hope so, Paul. Thank you very much for this. Really enjoyed it.
Marcus Allen for another moon landing chat there. What did you think of that one, David?
Giant steps are what you take walking on the moon. I hope my legs don't break walking on the moon. God, Sting writes such simple lyrics, doesn't he? I was entranced by that particular version of this subject. I found his obvious scholarship and his balanced approach to it all enticing, and I will think this through again. I'll tell you one thing, young Paul. I don't find it difficult to believe that governments are more than capable of manipulating evidence, and that would never leave me. So yeah, let's see what we can do, and we got to get him back, of course.
Well, that sounds like another brilliant subject, especially with what's going on with Russia at the moment, with depressing stuff going on over there at the moment, and the Cold War. It sounds like a bit of a no-brainer, doesn't it?
Well, something's going on that is potentially nasty. Remember, I'm from that generation. I remember the Cold War. And something was going on then which was nasty, but you'd never get to the truth of it.
Yeah.
Political theatre. Dangerous, dangerous subject, and something we need to look into.
And just for the record, I just want to wrap up my thoughts on the moon landing stuff, especially after 2 shows and after myself fishing around in it. I don't believe anything about it. I don't believe that they didn't go. I don't believe that they did go. I just think it's I believe it's a very fishy subject. There's a lot of questions, a lot of unanswered questions, and I don't think it will ever be completely either proved or disproved or something, and that's kind of my stance. And my main thing with it is actually when you've got people like Gordon Cooper that's saying he's seen UFOs, craft that are hovering above it, moving in ways that engines that we as we know it can't control a craft to do that and stuff, and Ed Mitchell as well. You're hearing so much stuff out there, and it doesn't have to be aliens. I'm not talking. UFOs doesn't automatically equal aliens. UFOs just unidentified flying objects. A craft that we can't identify because we don't know how it flies the way it is. And if they existed around that time, then to me it's not a case of did they get to the moon. Was the moon landings a legitimate process of them getting in the moon, or are they sitting there having a cup of tea now watching baseball or the latest football game with their feet up on a table? It could be, but I think we've had our moon hit for this week, don't you, David?
Oh, I'm all mooned out at the minute, yeah.
Although I wouldn't.
The next mooning I'm doing is after the pub.
I wouldn't not getting David Icon to talk to us about how it might have been man-made.
Oh, God. David, come on. Defend yourself. Defend yourself on our show.
That one is a really out-the-box one. But, free thought and open minds, we'd love to get David Icon here because people out there love him or hate him. He's an intriguing guy, and he certainly knows how to speak for hours on end. So he's every podcaster's dream, I think.
Free thoughts, open minds, and a good old chinwag. What more do listeners want?
Okay, well, coming up on the show, we've got Neil Pitt to talk about the New World Order, and he's going to tell us about how it's there as a good thing. He's written a book about it, and he's going to come on and tell us all about his book. We've also got the Jonathan Zapp interview coming up. Courtney Brown coming on, talking to us about the 9/11 project that they've been doing, and plenty more people in the pipeline. We're constantly talking to people and getting them on our show. So it's been a good year for us. It's been very exciting. We're really pleased with some of the guests we've had on, and we intend on keeping this thing going and building it. And we need you guys to do that. So we appreciate everyone downloading the show and listening to the dramaturgia, David.
It's not over yet, young Paul. We haven't conquered the universe yet.
No, but we've laid the foundations for our artillery.
It begins.
Thank you, people. We'll be speaking to you soon, and we look forward to it. Take care. Bye.
Chazzy.